Hi everyone, welcome to the webinar. This is How is Aid Changing? An Introduction to ODA Modernisation. Sorry, I just want to check that you can all see those slides that I'm sharing now. Hopefully I should be able to scroll through them. So there's the title. If you can't see the slides, if you could just type a question into the question box and my colleagues will try and help you out. We want to make sure that everybody can see the slides that are on the screen right now. Okay. So, thanks everyone for joining us today. My name's Cordelia Lonsdale. I'm the Senior Policy and Engagement Advisor at Development Initiatives, and I'm here today with Rob Chu, DI's Head of Technical Development. Rob, do you want to say a quick hello?
Hello everyone, and thanks for joining.
So a little bit about us before we start. Development Initiatives is an independent international development organisation. We work on the use of data to drive poverty eradication and sustainable development. And just before we dive into the content, just to explain a little bit about how this webinar will work. So first of all, just to note that we are recording the presentation. A number of you have asked this. So yes, we are recording the presentation part of this, and we'll make the recording available on our website afterwards. When we get to the section at the end where we have a bit more questions and discussion, we won't be recording that. What we'll do is capture some of the key discussion points, and we might summarize these in a post-event blog, but within that blog we won't be attributing comments to individuals or organizations. We're just doing that to help people understand the key issues that come out of the discussion. There's a lot of content to get through. What we're going to do is sort of spend the first part of the webinar going through that content, but you should feel free to ask questions or share comments in the question box, which should be in your dashboard. So just pop questions in as they arise. Also, if you have technical issues, you should feel free to raise a question in that question box as well. What we'll do is collate all of the questions for answering probably mainly at the end of the discussion. And at that point, we will also invite people, those who want to identify themselves and ask a question, and we'll give you the opportunity to do that as well. We might not be able to get to all the questions during the webinar, and in this case, we'll make sure we follow up with you afterwards just to make sure that your question is answered. So that's that housekeeping. I also just wanted to mention that this webinar is really just designed to support stakeholders in their engagement with the official OECD information. Basically, Rob and I and our colleagues have done quite a lot of work on ODA modernisation and ODA rules over the years, and we wanted to share that knowledge just in the interest of sort of providing a public good to the community. However, while we've made every effort to sort of get our facts straight and get everything correct, we're not an official representative of the OECD process. So please treat the information that we're sharing here with some caution. What we'll do is afterwards we'll provide references to all of the official information that we're aware of, so that you can go away and do your own reading. And we really strongly recommend that you do refer to this official information after the webinar. Okay, so just to share the contents, what we'll cover in the webinar. So part one, we will start with a very quick look at what ODA modernisation actually is, to make sure that everyone's on the same page. A lot of you probably already know this, but it's just worthwhile just going back and looking at the actors, the timeline, the sort of the key issues that are driving this. So we'll spend a bit of time on that. Part two is when we'll actually dive into the changes, where Rob will take over for most of that. We'll look at, first of all, the changes to how existing ODA reporting is going to change. And then we'll take a brief break to have a bit of a poll, some audience interaction, just to find out what your take is on all of this. In part three, we'll move into the expansion of ODA eligible flows. So this is where we're going to cover some of the new instrument flows and activities that we're going to see becoming a part of ODA. And then we'll move into part four, And this is where we'll just briefly touch on some of the implications of the changes. So from a sort of data and analytical angle, and then also from the policy and practice angle as well. But we actually won't spend too long on that because we want to move into part 5 and get some time for taking questions from you and also to hear your views in a bit of discussion. So that's what we'll be covering, and I think we've got quite a few people on the line now, so I'm going to dive into part 1. So what is ODA modernisation? I think, as most of you know, the OECD's Development Assistance Committee, or the OECD DAC, is a group of donor governments plus the EU, and this is the body that effectively governs the policy around official development assistance, or ODA. You might hear us call it ODA in this presentation as well. The OECD DAC defines what ODA is. It sets rules for which types of spending count as ODA and which countries are eligible to receive it. And it produces statistics on ODA and other resource flows to aid recipient countries. So in 2012, the ODA modernisation process pretty much kicked off, and this is at a high-level meeting. The OECD DAC members decided that the ODA concept and the statistical system that captures some reported ODA needed updating and modernising. And the overarching purpose of the change is so that the ODA statistics and the concepts better reflects the development finance landscape. So we'll get into what that actually looks like in a second. But first of all, we just wanted to spend a bit of time looking at why these changes are happening, why they're happening now. So from our perspective, we kind of see 2 key drivers of change, I guess, 2 broad areas. And the first area is broadly technical. So this is where the DAC is saying they need to make technical improvements to ODA statistics and the rules that govern how ODA is reported by members, by the DAC donors. And this is chiefly, firstly, in order to ensure consistency, to avoid discrepancies between donors that are caused by just maybe different interpretations of some of the reporting rules. And this is what we'll see when we get onto, for example, talking about in-donor refugee costs. And secondly, there's just a need to more accurately reflect what's called donor effort allocated to development activities in the official data. So this is where perhaps donors are undertaking activities that they just feel the current ODA reporting system isn't really reflecting. So that's the technical area. And then there's a second area of drivers of change, I guess, that's we've kind of characterized as being policy and political. And we would see this arising partly from the policy agenda of individual DAC members, but also from the changing global context for aid giving and for development cooperation. So this is obviously quite complex and multi-layered, but some of the reasons for the changes that you might hear talked about, just a few of them. So number one, there's a kind of changing landscape for development cooperation, and this is impacting on the official role of official aid. Since the ODA concept was developed in the 1960s, there's many more types of finance which are available to developing countries, and this can help sort of pay for development. And certainly since the Sustainable Development Goals were agreed in 2015, we've really had a lot of people say that now is a good time to re-examine the role of official aid in this broader context. So that's one. The second driver is around a push to increase private sector partnerships by DAC members. There's a couple of reasons for this. Certainly, one of the reasons you'll hear is the high costs of meeting the Sustainable Development Goals. You know, I think we all recognise that in this context, aid probably won't be enough. So that's one reason. There's also a mix of other incentives and drivers for donors to increase their engagement with the private sector and to use official development assistance to do that. Thirdly, there's the perceived sort of need to target ODA better, and you can do this through incentives by changing the ODA rules to create incentives. And you might see more of this when we get on to talking about ODA loans, but essentially this is about using the rules to increase more concessional financing flows for the least developed countries and or sort of fragile and conflict-affected countries. And then finally, there's the sort of influence or impact of new and emerging donors in the development cooperation landscape. So some of these donors are delivering development assistance in different ways in the form of South-South cooperation, and this has sort of created a global policy environment where there are new and different ways of doing things that influenced this discussion at the DAC, we think. So the next thing I wanted to talk about was the timeline very briefly, and we might come back to this in the discussion because we could spend a while on the timeline and the process. But essentially, what you'll see here, we talked about the sort of push for ODA modernization coming out of the 2012 DAC high-level meeting. In 2016, they did agree some of the rule changes in top line and kick-started some of the more detailed negotiations. What we're expecting now, we're sitting in 2017, where the changes are expected to be finalized at the October HLM. And then in 2018, we'll move into a sort of implementation phase, different phases of changes for the different areas. And then finally in 2019, the intention is to be in sort of full phase implementation. So the 2018 data, which will be reported in 2019. I will say that to our understanding, it's possible this timeline could change. The official process could be experiencing some delays. At the moment, we don't have any official information, however, to the contrary, that would allow us to change this timeline for certain. So we're going to talk in the webinar on the assumption that this timeline will be met, but it's just a flag that this might not be set in stone. And we'll talk a little bit more about the individual timelines when we're in the individual areas of change later on in the webinar. Okay, so at the top line, there are two key areas of the changes to ODA that we're going to cover in the webinar. The first area is this graphic on the left, so updating, clarifying, and streamlining the existing ODA reporting. And this is where we'll talk about ODA loans and debt relief. We'll talk about in-donor refugee costs, and we'll talk about code lists, so purpose codes, sector codes, also channel codes. So that's part one. And then in the next area of change, we'll talk about expanding ODA to bring in new activities and new financing instruments. And this is where we'll probably talk about private sector instruments and also the peace and security areas. Now, just to flag, there's a third area of change that some of you might have heard of, and this is Total Official Support for Sustainable Development, or TOSD is the acronym. So what we've decided is that because the TOSD discussion is an area that's actually much broader than ODA, we've decided to leave it out of this particular webinar. It's just a bit out of scope, and there's quite a lot to get into already with ODA modernization. If you're particularly interested in this topic, do let us know, because we might decide to cover it in future work, but we won't be covering TOSD in detail in this session. Okay, so I think that's all the introductory section out of the way, and we can actually get on to talking about ODA modernization in detail. So for this next section, I'm going to hand over to Rob to move into part two, changes to existing ODA reporting. And I think the first section is ODA loans. So over to you, Rob.
Yes, thanks, Cordelia. So, yeah, ODA loans. As Cordelia has already alluded to, there are some areas of the rules around ODA modernization, some of the new provisions that are not yet wholly agreed. But with ODA loans, this is one area where we know the rules that will become into force. The changes have been agreed, we know what will happen, and we have some actual real data about the impact of these changes. And this shows that these new rules will result in some significant changes. to the amount of ODA reported, certainly by some donors. So what is happening to loans? Well, in order to understand the changes, we first need to be clear about how loans are accounted for in ODA at the moment. So I'll just take a minute to cover the current rules. In order to qualify as ODA, loans must be concessional, they must be soft loans. And the way this is measured, the concessionality of a loan is assessed by calculating what's known as its grant element. Now, the phrase grant element does not imply that there's any grant funding included in the loan. This is simply a statistic that is calculated to measure the softness of a loan. It's expressed as a percentage of a percentage value, and the higher the percentage, the higher the grant element, the softer the loan. And you need to understand a bit about that in order to understand the changes. The calculation of grant element for any given loan depends on four things. The interest rate of the loan, obviously the lower the interest rate, the softer, the more concessional the loan is. The second element is a comparator interest rate, known as the discount rate or the reference rate. Now, in order to say how soft a loan is and how low an interest rate is, you need some kind of comparison. And the reference rate should, in an ideal world, represent something like the market rate that a lender could expect to get on a loan. So you can tell by comparing the actual rate with this reference rate how soft the loan is. And the point of why I'm mentioning this is the higher the reference rate, the higher the grant element of any given loan, the higher a figure that calculation gives you. And the reference rate that is currently used for calculating grant elements was set about 40 years ago, when market interest rates were much higher than they are. So the reference rate that's currently used to calculate grant elements is set at 10%, which is, many people think, somewhat too high. Now, the third element in calculating, the third part of calculating the grant element is the length of the loan. So the longer the period of the loan, the higher the grant element. And fourthly, whether there is any grace period, any time before payments actually begin on that loan. Now, under the current rules, a loan with a grant element of 25% or more has the full value of the loan counted as ODA. So this means that a highly concessional loan, something with perhaps a 90% grant element, that counts for the same amount of ODA as something that is only somewhat concessional, slightly concessional, so a loan that only just makes that 25% threshold. So two very different loans with two very different borrowing costs associated with them counts for the same amount of ODA in the statistics. The other thing to point out about the way loans are treated in ODA at the moment is that capital repayments are subtracted from the headline net ODA figure. So any old ODA loans that are currently being paid off, the amount of capital repayments on those loans is actually subtracted from the figure that is reported against each donor for the amount of aid they give, the amount of ODA they give. Now, the big change here is that once ODA modernisation is implemented, only that grant element percentage of the loan will count as ODA. So this differs markedly from the old method, because in future, a $10 million loan, for example, with a 25% grant element will count for $2.5 million of ODA, whereas before the full 10 million would have been included as ODA. Whilst a loan of $10 million with a 90% grant element, that will count for $9 million of ODA. So there's a very different treatment of loans at different levels of concessionality. in future. So this will allow a better comparison of the amount of effort that donors are actually putting into giving ODA. There are also changes to the way this grant element is being calculated, though. I've mentioned the discount rate, the reference rate, that's currently set at 10%. That is changing, it's being reduced. However, it's going to be, the different reference rates are going to be applied to countries at different income groups. So the reference rate that's going to be applied to loans to upper middle income countries will be just 6%, very different from the current 10%. That'll result in a lower grant element being calculated for loans to those countries. For lower middle income countries, the reference rate will be 7%, and for least developed countries and low income countries, that reference rate will be set at 9%, not very different from the current 10%. The reason behind this is the greater perceived risk of lending to the very poorest countries. So effectively, donors will be rewarded, if you like, for taking higher risks in lending to the very poorest countries, because they will have a higher proportion of their loans to low-income countries and least developed countries counted as ODA, due to the fact that a higher grant element will be attached to these loans because of the higher reference rate. However, in order to make sure that the most concessional lending goes to the poorest countries, the threshold, the amount, the size of the grant element that's required in order for a loan to count as ODA is also changing. And again, that's going to be differentiated between countries at different income levels. So a loan to a least developed country or a low income country will have to have a grant element of at least 45% to count as ODA, as opposed to the current 25%. On the other hand, loans to lower middle income countries will only have to have a grant element of at least 15% to count as ODA, and upper middle income countries, the loans will only have to have a grant element of 10% or more to count as ODA. And then the other thing that's happening to the way loans are accounted for in ODA is that those capital repayments that used to be subtracted from the headline ODA figure will no longer be subtracted. Once that grant element of the loan is calculated and included in ODA, there'll be no subtractions made from that. So what this means is that for some countries, for some donors, the reported levels of ODA will appear to be significantly different to what they are under the old rules. For example, Japan's is a country that has a lot of outstanding ODA loans from years ago, and the repayments that are being made on those loans are being subtracted from Japan's ODA, which keeps Japan's ODA lower. Now, despite the fact that in future Japan will only be able to count the grant element of its new loans as ODA, the fact that old loan repayments will no longer be subtracted means that Japan's ODA will appear significantly higher under the new rules than under the old rules. And there are statistics that have been recently released by the DAC that show that Japan's ODA would have been 36% higher in 2015 had the new rules been in place compared to the old rules. Germany, on the other hand, gives loans at a lower average grant element than is the case for Japan, and also Germany has rather less old ODA loans that are currently being paid off and having their repayments subtracted from Germany's ODA. And Germany, on the other hand, their ODA would have been 13% lower under the new rules than under the old rules. So for people that watch aid and for people that look at how much different donors are giving, this change around ODA loans has a real impact. Moving on from loans, but staying in that same area, debt relief. Now, the rules around debt relief are also going to change in certain areas. The current rules are that debt relief from the official sector, that is advanced by governments or government agencies, can be counted as ODA both for debt forgiveness and debt rescheduling. This debt relief that's counted as ODA, it can apply to loans that were originally reported as ODA, or loans that were outside of ODA, loans that didn't meet the 25% concessionality threshold that might have been included in other official flows, and it also can apply to private lending. Now currently the full face value of any forgiven loan, plus any accrued interest, less any capital repayments that have already been subtracted from ODA, that is counted as ODA. Under the new rules, debt relief on loans that were not originally counted as ODA will be treated in the same manner as before, so private loans or very low concessionality loans. However, the fact that new ODA loans will only have their grant element counted will mean that the rules on debt relief, if any of those loans are in later years subject to debt relief, will also have to change. So at present, though, the new rules have not been agreed. Now, there is an argument that debt relief on ODA loans could be excluded altogether from the headline ODA figure, because of the fact that, as I referred to earlier, the reference rate that is used to calculate the grant element includes or takes into consideration the risk of default when lending to poorer countries. So if donors have already been rewarded for taking higher risks, then it would seem to be double counting to also give them credit for ODA when those loans are, if those loans are forgiven later in later years. However, there's a counter argument to that, that the complete removal of debt relief from ODA loans might disincentivize donors from providing this kind of assistance. Now, the next opportunity for donors to move towards agreement on this will be at the DAC HLM next month, and we'll be watching that very closely. So I'll now hand back to Cordelia to talk about what changes are happening in donor refugee costs.
Great, thanks, Bob. Okay, so in donor refugee costs, so this, strictly speaking, is not part of the ODA modernisation package, at least not as the DAC would see it. The reason we've included it in this webinar is, well, a couple of reasons. Firstly, because the changes are kind of happening to the same timeline, and it does very much relate to changes to how ODA is reported. And secondly, there's obviously quite a lot of interest from I think particularly some of the stakeholders on the line now, and as you know, that's because in part the reported in donor refugee costs for some DAC donors have significantly increased lately. The spending on IDRCS rose by, I think, 6-fold for over the last 10 years that we have data. So this issue's been somewhat in the spotlight lately, and we thought it'd be helpful to just go through the changes to reporting as we know about it. So the current situation is that OECD rules allow donors to report as ODA some of the costs of hosting refugees in the donor country during the first 12 months of their stay, and these costs are known as in-donor refugee costs, abbreviated IDRCs. To our analysis, some of the work that we've done, the reporting guidelines are somewhat vague. As a result, there has been some considerable variation between what and how different governments chose to report. The data that is actually reported is sort of quite difficult to understand as well. So, for example, you don't always get information on the actual numbers of refugees that have been supported by ODA, and this information would allow us to assess the extent to which the amount of ODA reported actually reflects the scale of refugee support provided by each donor. And we also think there could be descriptions of methodologies used in reporting, descriptions of the methodological changes that are applied year on year, and there's also a need for sort of more disaggregated data. So I think, to my understanding, the DAC sort of recognized the need to make these reporting guidelines a bit clearer and a bit more consistent. They surveyed donors to find out more about how each donor was reporting refugee costs, and they've set up a technical working group on this, which is sort of, to my knowledge, and somebody could correct me in the discussion, but the discussion is not about whether or not they should count, but it's more about how they're counted, and to make sure that the reporting guidelines are clarified and updated to ensure that in-donor costs are reported in a more consistent, comparable and transparent manner. So, to my understanding, the next steps are that the technical working group that is working to clarify the guidelines will come up with some expanded guidance, and that they will publish this soon. I think they were going to present an updated proposal to the DAC, I believe by the end of this month, but in the discussion someone might correct me on that timeline. But I think that's the process as we understand it. So the final issue we're going to touch on, and then we'll have a little break, is purpose codes, sector codes, channel codes. And Rob, back to you.
Yes, thanks, Cordelia. Yeah, so this is of interest to any of you that are actually in the business of analysing the data on ODA that's published by the DAC. You know, at the same time as the rules governing ODA are changing, there are also going to be some changes to this underlying data. Some of these are linked to the ODA modernisation agenda, others are things that are happening at the same time in parallel with the ODA modernisation agenda. Now, the DAC Secretariat maintains various lists of codes which are used by donors to report on their aid flows within the DAC databases. And these codes help us to understand and classify and interrogate the data on ODA, understanding what it's being used for, how it is being channeled to the beneficiaries of the aid, how it's being spent. Now, there are a few key areas of change here. There are some new sector codes that may help us to track ODA spending in a more detailed and granular way in certain priority areas or in areas relating to global commitments. Just one example, there's a new code to track ODA spending on activities aimed at ending violence against women and girls, which is an area that has not been tracked within the data before. There are a number of new codes within the government and civil society sector to more closely track aid efforts aimed at government reforms and the mobilisation of domestic resources. Also, the DAC is considering a new reporting code to track donor support to migration and mobility facilitation. Furthermore, there is work planned to more closely align the DAC codes with the goals and targets of the SDGs. At present, it's not an easy thing to see what aid money is being spent on which SDG because of the makeup of the codes. However, the time frame for this work is not currently clear. It's at a very early stage of discussion, but something we are watching closely. Linked to the ODA modernisation agenda, there's new channel codes. Now, channel codes tell you how or which organisations are in receipt of aid, whether the aid is being spent through government organisations, NGOs, multilateral bodies, and there are a whole bunch of new channel codes being published that donors will use to track aid that's being spent through various private sector organisations, both private sector organisations that are domiciled in developing countries and ones that are based in the donor countries themselves. This is all linked to the implementation of private sector instruments in ODA, which is a subject we'll touch on later in the presentation. There's also new finance type codes. At the moment, you can see how much aid is being given as grants versus loans, how much is debt relief, and a couple of different flavors of other financial instruments. This is being greatly expanded, and a whole new range of financial instruments are going to be potentially counted within ODA, including some that are relevant to what's known as a blended finance funding arrangements. So there's going to be finance types for syndicated loans, collective investment vehicles that will capture aid that is being given in such a way as to draw in additional funding from private investors. And the amounts mobilized from private investors will also be reported, so you'll be able to see where aid has actually been used to leverage further investment from private investors. Although the money from private investors won't be counted as ODA, you'll be able to see within the ODA data the additional investment mobilized by ODA. So, Cordelia.
Great, thanks, Rob. So that was a lot of information. So to give you a little break, I think we've got a poll ready to go. I'm hoping if I press this next slide, what I'm hoping you're going to see on your screen is a poll. We're really interested to find out what you think is the most important area of ODA modernisation. And we'll also just pause for a couple of minutes here to let you think of any questions that you might want to ask. So just as a reminder, if you put your questions in the question box, we'll make sure we collate those at the end. Okay, so it looks like the majority of you think that private sector instruments is the most important area, which we're about to get into, 56%. And then I can see that 31% of you think that peace and security is a really important area, followed by ODA loans, and nobody for in-donor refugee costs, which is interesting. So that's good news, because we're about to dive into private sector instruments now, I think, quite soon. And peace and security, yeah. Okay. So let's move on. If I can just go back to where we need to be in the slideshow. Sorry, bear with me. Okay, so this is part 3 where we talk about the expansion of ODA eligible flows. And the first thing we're going to get into, I'm just going to sort of put a caveat in front of this slide to say that this is obviously a really complex area. Rob and myself are by no means policy experts in peace and security, so we're going to do our best to tell you what we know about the changes in this area. But if you have questions on this that we can't answer, what we'll do is we'll try our best to follow up with you. We were also, as we'll touch on, we were expecting to have a little bit more information to share with you by this point, but we're still awaiting the casebook that will clarify some of this. But in any case, so let's dive into this. So peace and security. Essentially, before ODA modernisation or before this period of change, it's always been the case that donors could report ODA spending to, calling it a sector, it's probably more accurate to say an area, I think, but conflict prevention and resolution, peace and security. Okay, and then underneath that there were purpose codes, which included security sector management and reform, civilian peace building, conflict prevention and resolution, participation in international peacekeeping operations, reintegration, and small arms and light weapons control. Okay, so that's always been possible to report to those codes. However, financing of military equipment or services has always been generally excluded from ODA reporting. So there was seen to be a need to clarify these rules or update them, and this was partly because it was really felt that there was a sort of interrelationship of development and human rights and peace and security activities. DAC members felt they needed clarification on the ODA eligibility of activities involving the military and police, as well as some activities around preventing violent extremism. And the DAC members also wanted some clearer guidelines on if and how to report development-related training of military personnel. So in 2016, there was a sort of, I guess, a top line set of guidance on new ODA eligible activities, and this is all set out in the high-level meeting in 2016 published a communique, which I highly recommend you take a look at if you're interested in this area, because there's a lot more detail than we're able to go into here. Essentially, the currently included activities were left the same, but new ODA eligible activities were added, and these were what's called non-coercive security related activities with a long-term sustainable development objective. And some of the examples that we have from that communique were training for partner military forces, so this is perhaps training in human rights or in gender sensitivity, that kind of thing. Secondly, support for costs where the military are used as delivery agents of development services or humanitarian aid. They specify in situations where that's a last resort. To my understanding, we need some further guidance on what exactly that looks like. I think they're working on that. And then finally, partner country-led educational activities to prevent violent extremism. ODA still cannot be spent on regular military costs, so this means salaries, equipment, or equipment maintenance. Now, according to the DAC Secretariat, the implications of these changes on the ODA levels shouldn't be significant. So they say that peace and security related expenditures represent 2% of bilateral ODA, and these minor adjustments to reporting rules cannot impact on ODA volumes in any significant way. So that was the line from the DAC Secretariat. I think when we reviewed the decision in 2016, we did think there could be a risk that depending on how the wording in this communique or the wording in these rules were interpreted, there was a risk that these changes might result in resources being diverted away from activities with a developmental and poverty reduction focus, potentially in favour of those that might align with national security and political priorities. But I would underline that at this point, we're still waiting for clarification of these new rules. There's going to be a casebook published, and this should really tell donors a bit more about what these rules mean, how to publish ODA according to these updated rules, and just give further guidance on the implementation of these reporting rules. Last time I checked, this casebook hadn't yet been published. I think we're still waiting for it. Obviously, as soon as that is published, we'll probably do some analysis and we'll be able to share that with people on the line. But there might be other people in the webinar who want to correct me on any of this. I'd be very interested to hear other people's views. And then a related area of change that I'll just touch on is around peacekeeping costs. So the peacekeeping coefficient is a term you might have heard, and this basically refers to the proportion of funds that donors give to UN peacekeeping that can be reported as ODA. So that's the peacekeeping coefficient. The peacekeeping coefficient, so the proportion of funds that donors report to UN peacekeeping that they can report as ODA, has gone up from 7% to 15%. This is, might be perceived as a large rise, but actually this is due to the fact that until now only the activities of civilian UN personnel were counted when calculating how much of the UN's peacekeeping work is ODA eligible. So now that bilateral donors, as we've just seen, now that bilateral donors are going to be allowed to count some activities of uniformed personnel as ODA, so in order to be consistent, they needed to change this peacekeeping coefficient as well. Our estimation, and I need to add, this is just an estimation, we haven't done a lot of detailed work on this, but we think this might amount to approximately 500 million of additional ODA reported annually, and that's based on the 2015 numbers, but we need to do some more work on this. We haven't done detailed data analysis on this, that's just an estimate. What we do think is that there's probably a need for greater transparency in reporting of these costs. At the moment, they seem to be reported to the CRS as core funding in a lump sum, and that's the case with most reporting on multilateral funding. And we can't get a breakdown of the specific types of activities that are funded around UN peacekeeping. So that's something else we'll be looking at closely when we get into doing more analysis on this. Okay, so I think that's it for the sort of peace and security area. And now we're going to dive into what you all think is most important. So that's private sector instruments. And over to you, Rob.
Thanks, Cordelia. Yes, private sector instruments. Well, the first thing to remember is that some investments in private companies have been a part of ODA for a while. Equity investments, certain types of equity investments in companies in developing countries have been eligible for ODA reporting since 1995. However, these have always accounted for a pretty tiny proportion of total ODA, typically less than 1% of total ODA in any given year. Over the years, some DAC members have established development finance institutions, or DFIs, also some specific investment funds or special purpose programs to engage in the private sector in a development context. These organizations use a combination of equity investments and loans to invest in or generate investment for private sector organizations in developing countries. These organizations, these DFIs, are also in recent years increasingly engaging in activities that are often referred to as blended finance or catalytic aid. So under these blended finance arrangements, a donor or DFI can mobilize additional investment from commercial investors through a variety of means. So perhaps the provision of guarantees on loans, or first loss capital, so whether the donor or the DFI agrees to bear the initial financial loss in case the borrower defaults, thus lowering the risk for other investors. So this can potentially generate investments in developing countries that are many times greater than the amount of funding provided by the donor or DFI. So there's a variety of ways in which these DFIs are engaging with or investing in the private sector in developing countries, but most of these activities do not currently qualify as ODA, mostly because they do not meet the concessionality criteria associated with ODA. So the grant element of a loan is too low to meet the 25% threshold. Now, donors have wanted to update the system to provide better incentives for the use of private sector instruments in developing countries and to reflect this activity that's been going on in ODA. So this is one area where the rules are not yet finalized, but it's quite clear that any rules that are agreed are going to allow for a significant expansion of reporting of investments in private companies as ODA. Loans to private companies that are virtually non-concessional or very low levels of concessionality will be counted as ODA. And the underwriting of commercial activities through guarantees, which was not previously counted as ODA, a proportion of that will in future be counted as ODA if these rules are agreed and implemented. And as I referred to earlier, that this type of finance also includes things that are used to mobilize additional funding from private investors via blended finance. Now, these sorts of investments are mostly, as I've referred to, carried out by development finance institutions, DFIs, which donors have specifically established to manage the funding of private companies in developing countries. Now, because they miss the current rules on concessionality, these activities are often non-concessional in nature. The ODA eligibility for private sector instruments will be judged on different criteria. They will not need to meet the same concessionality requirements as the rest of ODA. And the criteria that they'll be judged on is something called additionality. Now, this might be financial additionality, so an investment that the market would not have provided on its own, or perhaps developmental additionality, adding developmental value to normal commercial activities. But this concept of additionality is perhaps somewhat complex, perhaps somewhat subjective even, and relies on quantifying somehow whether the financial or developmental impact brought about by this activity is something that would not have occurred otherwise. So PSIs, even while they may not be concessional, still must have economic development or the welfare of developing countries as an objective. But how these additionality criteria will be defined and measured is still a matter for discussion. Now, when reporting PSIs, private sector instruments, as ODA, the draft rules that we have seen give donors two options for how this is going to be reported. The first option is known as the instrument approach. This is where the donor or the DFI reports their activities at the level of the individual activity, on a deal by deal or a loan by loan or an investment by investment basis, similar to how donors lending and equity investments are reported to the DAC at the moment. On the other hand, donors will be able to use what's known as the institutional approach instead. This is going to be an either or. So donors will, under the institutional approach, report any capital funding provided to the DFI as ODA. Now, the proportion of the funding that is actually included in the donor's ODA figure, that's going to be determined through some form of institutional assessment, so of each DFI. That will determine the level of ODA eligible activities actually carried out by that DFI. So under the instrument approach, you will have, say, the grant element of private sector instruments that have been actually advanced to recipient countries or businesses in recipient countries counted as ODA. Under the institutional approach, you'll have a proportion of the donors' funding that they give to DFIs counted as ODA. One important point is that the DAC have committed to having DFIs that are funded via the institutional approach, or where the ODA is reported by the institutional approach. Those DFIs will also have to report at the activity level. That activity level reporting won't determine how much ODA is credited to the donor, because the ODA credit will depend on the institutional funding, but we will still see activity level, deal by deal reporting in order to preserve transparency. Now, while this could potentially increase ODA levels and perhaps leverage investments in poorer countries, the risks traditionally associated with the use or with private sector investment for development are a concern to some. There's a significant change to ODA implied in these new rules, where there is a part of ODA that does not need to be concessional anymore. It merely has to meet these additionality criteria. Also, with investments involving the private sector, there is a risk that the level of transparency for PSIs will not be the same as for the rest of ODA, as some of the information about the terms of deals, etc., the actual interest rates in terms of loans, they might fall under the heading of commercial confidentiality, and therefore not be made public. Now, note that we mentioned TOS-D earlier. For those of you who are following the debate about TOS-D, one important thing to be aware of is that the private finance, if there's any private investment mobilized by these PSIs, as I referred to earlier, that's not going to be counted as ODA, but it may well be counted within TOS-D, depending on how the TOS-D rules are finalized. And another thing to remember about the private sector instruments is that because these instruments are at a typically low level of concessionality, potentially only a small proportion, a small percentage of them will be counted as ODA. So the amount included in ODA might actually not reflect or will not reflect the total value of investments in developing countries. So you will have to look elsewhere in the data for the total cash that is flowing from DFIs to developing countries. So that's a quick overview of PSIs. We will be able to return to this issue as the rules are finalized and as we get some more ability to put real-world data under the rules when they're finally agreed. But what I'd like to do now is just to move on a bit to the implications of the ODA modernization process as a whole. Firstly, I'd like to cover the implications for people like me, data analysts, researchers, people that spend their time looking at ODA data. And it's no exaggeration to say that these changes represent the largest shake-up in how ODA is counted for over 2 decades. There's going to be inclusion of new flows that have been previously excluded from ODA, and fundamental changes in the way that ODA loans are accounted for. And these will have significant implications for analysts and researchers once these rules are fully implemented. And some of these implications are that the ODA data may be more granular and informative in some areas, but headline ODA figures will represent the actual flows to an even lesser extent than is the case currently. It's always been the case that headline ODA did not necessarily reflect the resources actually transferred to developing countries. Now that only a percentage of loans and an even smaller percentage of private sector instruments will be counted as ODA, there will be a significant difference between the ODA figures and the actual cash flow that is occurring between donor and developing countries. Also, the analysis of ODA will require more complex technical understanding than was previously the case. I spent quite a bit of time in this webinar talking about the technicalities around the calculation of grant element, which may have perhaps turned some of you off the whole subject. But the fact is that in order to understand how much ODA is being reported by donors, researchers are going to have to know how these things are calculated in future, because it was simple in the days when just the full face value of a loan was counted as ODA. In future, it's going to be a percentage of a loan, and that percentage will vary from loan to loan depending on the terms of that loan. So an understanding of that process and that calculation will be important if you really want to get at the facts behind what the ODA numbers mean. So, and the data, but one thing is that the data sets that we will be dealing with around ODA, these will contain new and different instruments, flows, channels, codes, details on the amounts mobilized from the private sector. So there will be data out there that will help us make sense of this. But what's going to be important is that researchers will need to take care to select the right data for different research questions. So the data required to examine donor behavior may be very different to the data required to understand the impact of ODA in any given country. So, and now I'd like to hand over to Cordelia to cover off the implications from a policy perspective.
Yeah, thanks, Rob. Yeah, I mean, I think Rob, you've given a great summary. I think some of the things you've just mentioned actually do have big implications for people interested in the policy as well. And I think actually the headline point for me is that the fundamental nature of ODA is changing. So in the materials that we'll share after the webinar, we'll just remind you of the ODA definition. So the core character of ODA is something that's concessional, and as Rob's explained, actually this aspect of concessionality is actually changing, and that for me is something to take note of. we'll also see, because of the rule changes and the incentives and the fact that new types of activities are eligible, we'll also probably see new and different actors taking an increased role in the development landscape. And I'd probably highlight development finance institutions, DFIs, other private sector actors, private companies, investors, and also potentially military and security actors. And because of the point Rob was making earlier on about the headline ODA figures now being different than the flows, I think that's really important for anyone who's looking at how ODA contributes to financing the SDGs, anyone interested in monitoring the UN commitments on ODA. The incentives for donors to give certain types of ODA will probably change, and Rob touched on the different incentives for donors, for example, to give ODA loans in different countries with the different reference rates and so forth. So if you've got a loan to an LDC counting for more ODA than the same loan in an MIC, that obviously will have an impact on donor behaviour. And it will be interesting to see what effect that has on donor decision-making, lending decisions. And the ability for donors to count a proportion of unfunded liabilities, their guarantees as ODA, this might also create incentives for donors to make increasing use of such instruments in developing countries. Not that that's necessarily a good or a bad thing, it's just something to watch out for, because we just don't know how these rule changes will affect behaviour. And then finally, Rob mentioned the data becoming more complex. That obviously has implications for transparency and accountability. The fewer people can understand the data, the fewer people there are to hold donors to account or hold actors to account, and that's something we need to keep an eye on. I think a final point is how does all this affect what we might call traditional ODA? So grants, technical cooperation, highly concessional loans. There may be an impact on the role of traditional ODA, particularly depending on where some of these new instruments, and particularly I think the private sector instruments, might end up being directed or used. There could be unintended consequences. We may see opportunity costs. There may also be more choice for some donors, and a wider range of instruments that donors and their partner countries can use. So we just can't say whether this is going to sort of open up a range of choices or impose constraints. We obviously can't yet be sure how all of these changes will affect donor behaviour, but what we do know from some small rule changes in the past is that it looks like rule changes in ODA can, to some extent, alter donor behaviour through creating different incentives. So yeah, I mean, we'll get onto the discussion in a second, but essentially our job, we think, is to keep on watching the data and looking at how this unfolds, and hopefully producing more materials, perhaps future webinars, to let you know what we find out.